Have you ever wondered how a single gunshot in Sarajevo could ignite the flames of a war that would engulf the entire world? A question that sends us spiraling back into the early 20th century, to an era marked by a complex web of alliances, rising militarism, surging nationalism, and rampant imperialism. A time when Europe was a tinderbox, merely waiting for a spark. That spark came on a fateful summer day in 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. An event that would cascade into the Great War, a conflict that would redefine the course of the 20th century. But let's take a step back. The world of the early 20th century was a stage set for conflict. Powerful nations, bound by a series of intricate alliances, were locked in an intense competition for global influence and resources. This was a world where militarism was on the rise, with nations building up their armies and navies, ready to flex their muscles at the slightest provocation. Nationalism, too, played a significant role. It was a double-edged sword, fostering unity within nations while simultaneously sowing seeds of discord amongst them. The desire for self-determination and independence, particularly in the Balkans, was a powder keg waiting to explode. Imperialism, the policy of extending a country's power through military force or diplomacy, was another key factor. It was a race for colonies, for resources, and for power. This race, however, was a dangerous game, one that only heightened tensions and rivalries. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the catalyst, the spark that ignited these volatile elements, setting off a chain reaction that led to the outbreak of World War I. A single bullet fired in Sarajevo reverberated around the world, toppling dominoes in a sequence that would draw over 40 countries into a war that lasted 4 long, grueling years. And so, with a single bullet, the world was plunged into a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity, a conflict that was to shape the world as we know it today. Now imagine the horror of the Western Front, where men lived and died in trenches, under constant threat from machine guns and poison gas. This was a conflict unlike any before, a stalemate of steel and blood, a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack, gain and loss. The Western Front stretched over 400 miles, from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a labyrinth of trenches and barbed wire where soldiers lived in squalor, surrounded by the dead and the dying. This was trench warfare, a brutal and unforgiving battle of attrition. No battles encapsulate the horror of this warfare more than the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of the Somme, fought in the summer of 1916, saw the British Army suffer 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. By the end, over 1 million men from both sides had been killed or wounded. In the Battle of Verdun, the longest single battle of the war, the French and Germans grappled for 10 months over a few miles of ground. The French famously declared, "They shall not pass," and they held true to their word, but at a staggering cost. When the battle ended in December of 1916, an estimated 300,000 men had been killed, and twice as many wounded. These battles showcased the deadly efficiency of new weapons like machine guns, artillery, and poison gas. Warfare was no longer a matter of courage and valor, but of industrial might and technological innovation. Yet, amid the devastation, the human spirit persevered. Soldiers penned poignant letters and poems, sharing their hopes and fears. They found camaraderie and solace in shared hardship, and even in the darkest moments, they clung to their humanity. The cost of this stalemate was immense. By the end of the war, an estimated 8.5 million soldiers had been killed and over 20 million injured. The flower of a generation was lost and countless lives were shattered. Yet the world was forever changed. The war spurred technological advancements, from tanks and airplanes to medical innovations and communications. In this deadly stalemate, millions of lives were lost, and the face of warfare was changed forever. The Western Front was not just a physical battleground, but a crucible of the modern world, where old notions of war were discarded and the grim reality of industrialized conflict was laid bare. But the war was not confined to Europe. It spread to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, turning a European conflict into a truly global war. The Eastern Front was a theater of combat on a scale never seen before in human history. This was a vast, open expanse where armies could maneuver freely, a stark contrast to the entrenched stalemate of the Western Front. Here, the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, clashed with Russia, a member of the Allied powers. The battles were fierce, the losses heavy, and the consequences far-reaching. But let's not forget, this was not just a war of European powers. This was a global conflict that touched every continent. The sun never set on the British Empire, and this meant that Britain could draw upon its vast colonial resources. Troops from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa were brought to fight in distant lands, often with little understanding of the causes they were fighting for. In Africa, skirmishes and battles raged as the warring European powers used their colonial possessions as pawns in a larger strategic game. Territories changed hands, and the lives of countless Africans were upturned by a war that was not of their making. In Asia, Japan, siding with the Allies, seized German territories in China and the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the decline of the Ottoman Empire was hastened by the conflict. The British and French, with the help of Arab allies, fought the Ottomans in a series of battles that would ultimately reshape the region. And what of the impact on these non-European regions? The war disrupted societies, economies, and lives. Colonial troops returned home with new ideas and expectations, sparking demands for greater rights and independence. The boundaries of the Middle East were redrawn, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the scorching deserts of Arabia, from the jungles of Africa to the islands of the Pacific, World War I was not merely a European event. It was a global cataclysm that redefined the world as we know it. While soldiers fought on the front lines, the war also transformed the lives of those back home. World War I was a total war, a concept that encapsulates how the conflict consumed entire societies, not just the military. The home front was no longer a haven from the horrors of war, but an integral part of the war machine. Civilian populations found themselves thrust into the heart of the conflict as governments mobilized their economies for war. Factories that once produced consumer goods were now churning out weapons and ammunition. Farmers and food producers faced enormous pressure to feed not only their countrymen, but also the soldiers on the front lines. And as men marched off to war, women stepped up to fill the vacancies they left behind. Women's roles underwent a seismic shift during World War I. They took on jobs traditionally held by men, working in factories, on farms, and in offices. They served as nurses on the battlefield, drove ambulances, and even went into the trenches as telephone operators. This was a departure from the norms of the time, challenging traditional gender roles and laying the groundwork for women's rights movements in the years to come. But the mobilization of resources and the expansion of women's roles were not without their strains. The war disrupted traditional norms and values, leading to social upheaval. Inflation soared as governments printed money to pay for the war, causing hardships for many. Civil liberties were often curtailed in the name of national security, leading to tensions between governments and their citizens. All of these changes created a society under strain, a society profoundly transformed by the experiences of war. The boundaries between the home and the battlefield blurred, as did the lines between men's work and women's work. The war blurred the boundaries between the home and the battlefield, changing societies in profound and lasting ways. The Great War reshaped the world, not just through the shifting of borders and the fall of empires, but also through the transformation of societies and the lives of ordinary people. In 1918, the guns finally fell silent, but the peace that followed was fraught with its own challenges. The end of World War I was not a sudden, decisive victory, but rather a slow unraveling. The Central Powers, exhausted by years of grueling warfare and plagued by internal unrest, found themselves unable to continue the fight. This was particularly the case in Germany, where food shortages, strikes, and widespread discontent led to the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the formation of a new, democratic government. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was signed, marking the cessation of hostilities. But the end of the fighting was just the beginning of a new and equally challenging phase, negotiating the peace. In the Palace of Versailles, outside of Paris, the victorious Allied powers convened to determine the terms of the peace. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was a complex and controversial document. At its heart was a desire to punish Germany for its role in the war and to ensure that it could never again pose a threat to the rest of Europe. Germany was stripped of its colonies, its military was severely restricted, and it was forced to accept responsibility for the war and to pay reparations to the Allied powers. The treaty also redrew the map of Europe, breaking up the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires and creating new nations out of their former territories. But the Treaty of Versailles was not a lasting solution. Many in Germany felt deeply humiliated and unfairly treated, and these feelings of resentment and anger would fuel the rise of extremist ideologies. In particular, the clause that blamed Germany for the war, the so-called war guilt clause, was a source of intense national humiliation. Moreover, the treaty failed to address some of the fundamental issues that had led to the war in the first place, such as nationalism and the desire for self-determination among various ethnic groups. In many ways, the Treaty of Versailles planted the seeds of future conflict rather than fostering a lasting peace. The peace treaty marked the end of the war, but it also sowed the seeds of resentment and conflict that would erupt in World War II. World War I was more than a global conflict. It was a turning point in history that shaped the modern world. The legacy of the Great War extends far beyond the trenches, the battlefields, and the political treaties. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through every aspect of human life, forever altering the course of the 20th century and beyond. The collapse of empires is one of the most prominent and immediate consequences of the war. The Austro-Hungarian, German, Ottoman, and Russian empires, which had been the bedrock of the Old World Order, crumbled, giving way to new nations and redrawn borders. This redrawing of the map of Europe and the Middle East sowed the seeds of many conflicts that persist to this day. But the legacy of the war wasn't only geopolitical, it was deeply social and cultural. The war marked the end of an era of optimism and progress, replacing it with disillusionment and a loss of innocence. The catastrophic loss of life, the horrors of trench warfare, and the failure of old world leaders led to a profound questioning of established values and beliefs. The war also accelerated technological and scientific advancements. From tanks and airplanes to chemical weapons, World War I was a crucible of technological innovation. It was the first war where the full force of the Industrial Revolution was harnessed for destructive purposes. But it also spurred advances in medicine, communications, and other fields that would shape the coming century. Equally transformative was the shift in the global balance of power. The war marked the decline of European dominance and the rise of the United States and Japan as major world powers. It paved the way for the United States' emergence as a global superpower, a role it would firmly cement in the aftermath of the Second World War. And of course, the legacy of World War I includes the seeds of another, even more devastating conflict. The punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the war guilt clause and the heavy reparations imposed on Germany, fostered resentment and national humiliation. These factors contributed to the rise of extremism and set the stage for World War II just 2 decades later. World War I left a profound legacy, one that continues to shape our world in ways we are still grappling to understand. As we reflect on this transformative period in history, we are reminded of the enduring impact of our past on our present and future.